Hi, this is Professor Favors with American Literature. So today's topic is on Sylvia Plath's Daddy. This particular poem is part of American literature since 1945 to the present. This lecture also introduces postmodernism, provides an overview of confessional poetry. There's a special topic on parenting styles and critical approaches. So this is American literature, Sylvia Plath's Daddy. This presentation is subject to fair use. So Sylvia Plath, 1932 to 1963. Do remember that end date, 1963. Sylvia Plath was born in Boston, Massachusetts. Plath's father, a professor of biology at Boston University and an authoritarian figure within the family, died when Plath was 8 years old. And Plath struggled for the rest of her life to come to terms with her complicated feelings for him. Plath's mother went to work to provide for Plath and her brother. From a young age, Plath was a high achiever, showing an early talent as a writer and poet. She received a scholarship to Smith College and after graduating was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to Cambridge University. In spite of a history of depression and one suicide attempt, Plath excelled at academics and worked hard on her writing, periodically publishing her work. At Cambridge, Plath met the young upcoming British poet Ted Hughes. The two shared an intense and immediate attraction, marrying only a few months later. Plath gave birth to two children and engaged in domestic routines while still working on poems that would eventually be included in her posthumous collection Ariel. She continued to struggle with depression, and after discovering Ted Hughes' affair with a mutual friend, Asa Wevel, Plath's depression worsened. She eventually separated from Hughes and moved to London with her children in an attempt to start over on her own. During a particularly difficult winter where she saw her novel The Bell Jar published to less than enthusiastic reviews in January 1963, Plath's mental state deteriorated. She committed suicide in February 1963, leaving her children behind, as well as the new collection of poems that would eventually make her famous after her death. The reason why I want you to pay attention to 1963 because that is the year of President Kennedy's assassination. So, about Daddy, 1962 published. Poets such as Allen Ginsberg, Anne Sexton, and Plath in the 1950s were willing to probe their psyches in very private, personal ways, confessing their deepest, most private, even disturbing feelings. In the time period, this kind of psychological probing of the self was new and provocative. From a feminist perspective, Plath in the Ariel poems openly explores her feelings of rage against the men in her life and against patriarchal authority in general. Plath also explores her feelings of ambivalence about being a mother, the cultural pressures she experienced of becoming a wife and mother, the pain she endured as a result of her husband's infidelity, and her battle with depression that culminated in suicide attempts. In Daddy, the prevalent Nazi imagery is not autobiographical, but is used to depict the extreme emotions at work in the narrative voices desperate, raging attempt to cut the cord of paternalistic domination. The narrative voice urgently and angrily wants to break from daddy's control, domination, and influence in order to forge her own identity as a woman and as a person. So we're still looking at the historical implications and 1828 to 1970. So remember Jim Crow, 1828, President Jackson dying, 1829. Don't forget the anti-slavery sentiment of 1830, Nat Turner's revolt, slavery debates, Oberlin College enrolling female students, Florida, Texas becoming states, Mexican-American War, Fugitive Slave Act, Dred Scott v. Sanford decision. Then we have a host of amendments after the American Civil War. We have the Emancipation Proclamation, Reconstruction era, President Lincoln's assassination, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, the abolitionist movement ending. And the reason why, again, that we go over this is because even though we can have abolition of slavery ending or abolition of slavery just in general, you still have people with a mindset that believes that slavery is necessary. And so even in a post-emancipation era, Reconstruction era, you're still having to contend with certain ideas. That's why, even in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, you can still have Jim Crow laws. You can still have the Separate Car Act. You can still have the founding of the National American Women Suffrage Association. So the literary writers are always still writing to the events of the day. So then we have Plessy v. Ferguson, where separate but equal doctrine is constitutional. Spanish American War, Great Migration of Blacks, Jim Crow laws, World War I, 1914 to 1918. Then the 19th Amendment is when women get the right to vote. Not black women, but white women. Uh, World War II, 1939 to 1945. Then we have the Cold War, which was really not necessarily a war. It was in terms of direct fighting. It was more political. Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. And then our new listing here, our new historical implication is President John F. Kennedy's assassination, which was 1963. So let's not forget the Jim Crow timeline with Thomas Dartmouth Rice creating the Jim Crow character, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. We have a particular case where states cannot prohibit segregation on carriers, the Supreme Court declaring the Civil Rights Act of 1865 unconstitutional. Also, equal but separate accommodations for Louisiana State Separate Car Act. We also have the Supreme Court upholding Plessy v. Ferguson, which solidifies the Jim Crow era. Jim Crow laws expanding to segregation in different areas of life. Board of Education, Brown v. Board of Education, making separate but equal unconstitutional. And then we have a host of new legislation passed. Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, and then miscegenation laws. So American literature since 1945, this includes Southern literary renaissance, second wave, introduction to postmodernism, and then overview of confessional poetry. So a decade after the Second World War, and it was mainly the age of conformity, counterculture, and confession. So American literature since 1945 is the expectation of conformity with college-educated middle class embracing the values of the nuclear family. American literature since 1945 is the rise of counterculture, when writers began criticizing conformist culture, seeking to free literature from traditional formalism and align with improvisation in music and art. Storytellers of the Southern Renaissance resisted conformity and embraced distinctive regionality. This is also a period that introduces the confessional poets um, who shared disturbing details of their lives, exploring how the nuclear family could be a source of distress and how the personal situation affected perception of everyday life. And then it is also a period that represents the voices of radical feminists, conservative regionalists, and proud multiculturalists. It distinguishes between modernist and postmodernist storytellers. Lastly, it introduces the computer as being the most influential invention of the era. It's not the only one, but it's definitely the most influential. So during this time, there's this expectation of conformity, but literature is saying a different thing because there's always this idea that you have to challenge the status quo, and so you create the type of literature that's going to be counterculture or counter the status quo, and part of that is confessing what we used to keep silent. Remember, your parents usually had this idea that we don't air out our dirty laundry. We don't tell everybody our business. Well, that's completely different in this generation because everything is out in the open. So the My Papa's Waltz and Sylvia Plath's Daddy and works like those tend to embrace the confessional that we see now. All right, Southern Literary Renaissance. So until 1965, Americans lived under Jim Crow laws, disenfranchising of African Americans and keeping Black American citizens socially separate and legally inferior to white citizens. This spurred civil rights and Black power movements of the 1950s and the 1960s, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, calling attention to the idea that the American dream of prosperity and equal education was not shared by many. On the world stage, the Soviet Union organized a political bloc of Eastern European nations it conquered during World War II, dedicated to Russian-led state socialism, in which the state owns all businesses and administers all social services. This is contrary to American capitalism, where individuals own all businesses. The Soviet Union began testing its own atomic bomb in 1949, which contributed to the US and the Soviet Union entering the Cold War, which represented a period of geopolitical rivalry and not necessarily direct fighting. It ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. So when you are reading works, postmodern works, you are considering all the different historical factors that come to play. Then post-World War II, South moves into economic prosperity, creating the rise of the middle class, developing major southern cities, shifting from agricultural to industrial economy, and soldiers entering college for the first time on the GI Bill. Creative writing programs were piloted for the first time through the University of Iowa and Stanford University, offering a Master of Fine Arts degree. Soldiers enrolled in creative writing courses with the desire to tell their own stories. So now we are also beginning confessional prose through novel work as well. Southern writers exerted their influences over the creative writing programs, writing textbooks such as Understanding Poetry and Understanding Fiction, and facilitating writing workshops such as Iowa Writers Workshop. Southern Literary Renaissance was a diverse moment with regional variations that continued artistry, experimentation, and innovation. Although the period and its literary writers were initially reactionary to the expectation of conformity resulting in countercultural ideals, it embraced the reinvention of America and the American ideal through the medium of storytelling. And so now let's look at postmodernism, and then after this, confessional poetry. So postmodernism is characterized as the culture that comes after modernism. It refers to specific works of art created during the 1950s. Postmodernism is primarily defined under architecture, which refers to contemporary style of building, rejecting the minimalism of modernist architecture's glass boxes and towers. Postmodernist architects retain the functionality of the modernist building and decorate their boxes and towers with playful colors, forms, and ornaments referencing historical eras. Postmodernist writers play with material in their poems and focus on language and the book. They use experimental techniques developed by modernists and adopt a self-referential style of metafiction, which is defined as the story being just as much about the process as it is about the description of characters and events. It introduces the confessional perspective. Postmodernism represents the collapse of the grand narratives that explain all experiences, faiths, and truths found in politics, science, and religion. Instead, postmodern culture becomes a field of competing histories and a hybrid of multiple identities. The postmodernist author creates and represents many literary worlds and diversity of experiences. So that's your difference between modernism and postmodernism. So let's look at confessional poetry. Confessional poetry focuses on the first person I and centers on the self. It deals with transgressive subjects and subject matter, particularly those subjects that polite society would rather not address. That means it has a sort of Victorian quality in terms of what we used to do. Confessional poetry is counterculture to speaking about everyday life concerns. We're used to the ideal don't air out your dirty laundry, but confessional poetry actually reveals your dirty laundry. So it is often criticized as being self indulgent, raw, and personal. It tends to, poets tend to write about taboo topics such as mental illness, familial drama, suicide, and sexuality. The confessional poets may focus on divorce, deal with manic depression, rage, and sobriety. All right, so works consultant. So introduction to American literature since 1945. That's your link here. Southern literary Renaissance, second wave, 1945 to 1962. The poem is published in 1962. Don't forget that Plath commits suicide in 1963. Introduction to postmodernism. So Sylvia Plath's Daddy, critical approaches to investigate Sylvia Plath's poem Daddy, biographical and psychological approaches. That's the journal article. And then the Mayo Clinic information on parenting styles. Don't forget MLA. Oh, this is new. So MLA Style Center information about citing online lectures here. Then there's Purdue Owl on MLA Works Cited. So that's information for books, quotations, and then a guide as the as a general guide. Then, of course, the Britannica entry on Jim Crow laws, entry for Jim Crow laws, glossary of literary terms, writing for English courses, glossary, and then point of view from Merriam-Webster's dictionary. So these are all clickable links. All right, so Sylvia Plath resources. We have a Britannica entry for Sylvia Plath, the Poetry Foundation biography for Plath, Sylvia Plath and the Bell Jar, a selective uh, uh, references list through Roger Williams University, and then the National Biography, American National Biography on Sylvia Plath. So this is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening.